crash test dummy, patron saint of the motorist, a potent symbol of safety in an age of risk. He endures countless violent assaults to help protect our soft, vulnerable bodies, and has become a modern icon, leaving the sterile environment of the lab to enter the world at large. But as with any star, we see only the public image. Behind his blank-faced innocence lie dark secrets and a strange and gruesome past. Welcome to The Secret Life of the Crash Test Dummy.
I'm trimming up a head, and you try to make it look as much like a person as you can. You take off all the seams, take off all the flash. Like here we have a high seam, and I sand it down to make it look nice and smooth, and it'll clean it all up, and be nice and smooth just like your face. Everybody gets their favorite parts that they like to do. Vanessa, she likes doing the butts. I like working on the heads and feet and chests. When I first come here, I found it kind of morbid with body parts all over the place, and then after a while, it's like no big deal, you know, but at first it was kind of morbid.
Bringing a fully formed dummy into the world is an expensive business. A grown adult weighing in at 168 pounds and standing 5 foot 9 inches tall costs about $100,000. He has over 300 individually engineered parts, and every detail of his physiology is determined by law, from the foam in his flesh to the steel in his ribs, even down to his ethnically neutral skin tone. No new car is allowed on the road until the dummy has given it his thumbs up. He is perhaps the closest relative of the human. Once the dummy has left the factory, he enters a dangerous world. A technological kamikaze. His is a mechanical ballet of destruction, at once brutal and beautiful. The crash test dummy has not always been such a well-known figure. He began his career shrouded in mystery in the deserts of New Mexico. Here, a strange brew of Cold War paranoia and scientific experimentation came to a head in 1947. The Air Force claimed they discovered the crashed remains of a flying saucer. The episode entered UFO folklore as the Roswell incident.
All the newspapers west of Chicago had a headline that we had captured a flying saucer. There are reports that there were bodies involved, alien beings of some form. Anywhere from 3 to 5. Descriptions of 3.5 to 5 feet tall, large heads, big eyes, no ears as we know them, although they had orifices in the side of their head, a small nose, a slit for a mouth, long arms, 4 fingers. Why would they come to New Mexico? I think one of the key factors to me, 100 miles south of Roswell, the first atomic bomb in the history of the world was detonated. We had the V-2 rockets of White Sands being launched out into space.
Rocket away!
Just perhaps they were sitting out there looking and saw this taking place and might have wondered, what are these people up to?
Cold War, everything we did was classified. We didn't want people to know what we were doing. In 1997, shortly before the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident, the Air Force came out with a document titled Roswell Incident, Case Closed. And one of the things they claimed in there was that anthropomorphic dummies could have been confused with alien sightings at Roswell in 1947.
The crash test dummy had conjured up his first myth. But what was really happening out in the deserts of New Mexico?
SID was the first side impact dummy, developed in the late 1970s by the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. It is used in U.S. government-required side impact testing of new cars. Modern Marvels will be right back.
In 1947, in the deserts of New Mexico, an Air Force colonel named John Stapp began a bizarre, top-secret aeromedical project that would lead to the development of the first crash test dummies.
Colonel John Paul Stapp is sort of the father of this business in the sense that he was interested in how to protect air crewmen when they ejected out of an aircraft at high speed. And he didn't know any way to study that other than to subject human volunteers to loading that's very similar. One of the rules of human volunteer testing is you've got to be willing to do it yourself. So he was his own volunteer.
Stapp used this high-speed test track for a terrifying series of experiments.
He started the countdown.
5, 4.
Then, just as he reaches 0, you hit this enormous ram against your back and feel totally helpless. You're being given the biggest kick that could be delivered.
Remember, there was the old saying in the Army, don't volunteer. And in fact, there were several figures in the early days of this kind of work, before there were dummies, who were doing peculiar things. Several of these people became disabled.
Undeterred by the risks, Colonel Stapp pushed human testing to the limit. He was trying to work out the maximum speed at which pilots could safely eject. During a 7-year period, he volunteered for 26 potentially lethal experiments.
So Dr. Stapp kept going faster and faster, and finally in December 1954, he hit his fastest speed. According to the newspaper, 632 miles an hour. According to the calculations I made from feet per second, at one point he hit 639. But the average would be about 632. And he stopped very, very short. Just a matter of a second or less.
Stapp's record-breaking run made him the fastest man on Earth. He endured a massive 43 Gs during the deceleration, the equivalent of smashing into a wall at 70 miles per hour.
As he said, his eyeballs just about popped out. His eye started bleeding, and for approximately 10 minutes following his famous run, he could not see. But later in the hospital, his vision started returning. He also sustained blisters all over his body. Dust particles impinged upon his skin right through the flight suit he was wearing and raised rather interesting-looking welts, which fortunately went away.
Stapp's work was getting too dangerous. He had to find a substitute. What he needed was a dummy that was a replica human. But his first bionic man was somewhat Neanderthal.
The early dummies were very crude. They were just masses that were connected to simulate the weight and possibly a little bit of the articulation of the human. But in many ways, they were just sandbags to get the mass and the shape.
Distribution of body weights and centers of gravity. With cabin pressure differentials in excess of...
Stapp decided to replace this rather primeval human replica. He called on the services of an engineer named Sam Alderson. Alderson had been developing artificial limbs to help the thousands of servicemen mutilated during the Second World War.
So being involved in replacement parts for a human, I found it very fascinating to go ahead and duplicate the entire human.
The Air Force had a wealth of anthropometric data, which described the height, weight, and build of all its servicemen. Alderson used these measurements to create a model of the perfectly average pilot.
This is a very old dummy. It should have its 50th birthday very soon, a couple of years. This dummy itself was used for testing ejection seats. Here was a cavity. Within this were instruments that radioed back the data to a ground station. We have duplicated here some but not all of the motions of the human. These had to be adjusted so that they would respond to the shocks of ejection.
These proto-humans began to replace people in the myriad of experiments taking place in New Mexico. Research into ejection seats meant the Air Force now knew how to get pilots safely out of their aircrafts. The next problem was getting them back to Earth.
They found that if you visualize an axis through your navel, you can rotate around that axis up to 435 revolutions per minute, which is fatal to the human being. So they had to devise some other method, and eventually they did it with dummies, and these dummies would be released at high altitude, and different types of parachutes would be used to test them when they fell out of the balloons.
But one experiment encountered unusual problems over the desert town of Alamogordo.
Radio station KALG was playing a musical tune in the FM frequency called Tiger Rag. Unfortunately, one of the harmonic overtones from that radio station exactly matched the release signal for the dummies. The dummies were released and they came down in their parachute, landing in the drive-in theater. That was the first alien invasion of Alamogordo.
The arrival of the crash test dummy would revolutionize the military testing program. Practically every piece of equipment now had to pass through his hands before a human was allowed near it. The dummy had come of age. Finally, it was time for him to leave the wide open space of the desert, drawn by the lure of the big city.
Developed in 1970, Sierra Susie was one of the first female crash test dummies. The Sierra dummy family includes Sam, Stan, Saul, Sue, Sammy, and Toddler. Modern Marvels will return in a moment.
A A new era was beckoning for the crash test dummy. It was time for him to leave the desert wastes of New Mexico for the far north of the USA and the vast metropolis of Detroit. But it would be a while before the Motor City would welcome the wandering hero. Colonel Stapp's interest in parachute testing was waning. Events closer to the ground had begun to attract his attention. While reviewing Air Force accident statistics, he made an extraordinary discovery. The majority of serious accidents suffered by pilots, he found, didn't take place in the air at all, but in the short journeys to and from the airbase that the pilots made in their cars. And the problem wasn't unique to pilots. All over the USA, more and more motorists were meeting their deaths on the roads.
There was the realization that the number of people being killed on the highways was growing rapidly as more and more people were driving. And the projections were, if the sales continued, that there'd be very high death rates.
Stapp became obsessed with car safety and decided to try out his military mannequins in the driving seat. But cars were a new and alien environment for the dummy, and it was difficult to interpret the results he was getting. Stapp needed to develop a dummy based on actual car crash data from real, living subjects. But it was far too dangerous to use humans. So Stapp began his research using pigs as test animals.
Pigs were used, hogs, and they were anesthetized so that the pig wouldn't feel anything. After all, the anatomy of a pig is similar to that of some human beings, and the pig would be in the swing seat, and they would see what would happen to the flesh.
The information gathered from the injuries sustained by the pig could be fed into the design of the dummy's ribs. When news of the project leaked out, people were horrified, but not primarily because of a concern for the pigs. Putting safety in the spotlight had shown them for the first time how dangerous driving their cars could be.
Whenever you talk about the automobile industry, you're talking big numbers. You're talking enormous profits, enormous sales, many, many billions of dollars. And whenever you have that concentration of money, they're going to move to protect it and maximize their profits, not maximize safety.
Under pressure, the Pentagon pulled the plug on Stapp's test program. But over the next few years, it became clear that the problem could not be ignored forever. In 1966, Congress passed a series of laws making car crash testing a legal requirement. The hunt for the perfect artificial human was officially on, and there was some way to go.
When crash test dummies started to be used in the auto industry, they were an adaptation of the military dummies, and they were used initially pretty much for ballast. And when they were crash tested, they were just in there for weight. But as interest began to accrue in terms of protecting the occupants, questions began to be asked about, well, how realistic are these dummies, and can we make measurements that might relate to injury?
industry tried all kinds of new designs for the crash test dummy. They soon realized that they needed complex and detailed information about the real human body.
You need to develop what are called injury criteria. And you're going to use the dummy to measure these criteria. Can be forces, can be accelerations. And then these criteria should relate to injury in the human. So it might take, a couple 100 pounds to fracture something in the human, and you'd measure that in the dummy, and that would predict injury in the human.
They had to test something that behaved just like a living human being, without risking human life. Their solution? The human corpse. It's known in the trade as cadaver testing.
I remember when we were looking at testing cadavers at first, I went and observed an autopsy, and I remember I had to sit down in the middle of the autopsy just because of, so many sites that I hadn't observed before. And I think you do get desensitized. What you don't get desensitized to, though, is the respect and sort of the research you're doing and the importance of it.
It takes a lot of work to prepare a cadaver, or as some researchers call them, post-mortem human surrogates.
Following death, there's a number of changes that take place in the body, and one of these that most people are familiar with is rigor mortis, basically some chemical changes that make the body very stiff and tense. However, this wears off after a certain period of time, so it'll go through a tense period, and then ultimately it'll relax again. We actually do something that's called exercising a cadaver's joints, where we'll actually move the joints through a full range of motion in order to break up some of this stiffness. We try and replicate the living condition as well as we can. In the cardiovascular system, the heart, the aorta, we actually inject in a fluid. Can't really bruise a cadaver, but we put a dye in, and so if there's ruptures of some of the vessels, you'll see that this dye actually stains the tissue and would be similar to what a rupture or an approximation of what you'd get for bruising.
Once the corpse has been prepared, measuring instruments are fitted for the test.
What we would do is we would put instrumentation into the cadaver, and this would be various sensors, load cells, accelerometers, strain gauges, and these are attached to bone generally. So we would actually go in and we would screw or attach with wire these accelerometers and load cells to the bone itself.
In cadaver tests like these, the dead body gave scientists precise measurements of the forces needed to break bones and rupture blood vessels.
You need cadavers to develop dummies. There's a tremendous amount of cadaver research that has gone into developing every component within the dummy.
This cadaver test shows some of the problems of reproducing the behavior of the human body in a dummy.